Alright, we're going to move on and we're going to talk about some more editing commands. Let's start with the rotating command. The rotating command also uses a base point where you're working with the rotating command, and it works like this. Let me just draw a rectangle here. I'm going to start the rotating command. You can use your rotate button there on your ribbon, and it's going to ask you to select objects just like just about every other command that editing command that we have. It's going to ask me to select objects, so I'm going to pick the square, and then that's the only object that I want, so I'm going to right click to tell it I'm finished selecting objects. Now it's asking for a base point, just like the move command and the copy command we talked about a minute ago. But the base point in the rotate command acts as a kind of like a pivot point or a center point, because when you're rotating something, you're rotating it in a circular fashion. So it acts as basically like a pivot point. So I'm just going to pick somewhere out here in space, and then I'll show you what I'm talking about. Now notice on my command line it's asking me for a rotation angle. I'm just going to pull my cursor to the right. Remember, directly to the right is 0 degrees, directly up is 90 degrees, and directly to the left is 180, down is 270, and of course to the right again is either 0 or 360. So whenever it's asking for rotation angle, I can either pick the angle out here, but then I'm not being very accurate, or I can just type in an angle. So I'm going to type in an angle of 30. So on my command line I'm just going to type in 30 and then hit enter. So what that did is it rotated that object around that base point that I had selected 30 degrees. Now I'm going to undo that. I'm going to just type in U and hit enter. And I'm going to start my rotating command again. This time what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a point on my object for my base point. So it's asked me to select my objects. I'm going to pick my object, hit enter. Now it's asking me for my base point. I'm going to bring up my object snap endpoint, and then go over here and pick the endpoint of either one of these lines. It doesn't matter. It's a rectangle, so the corners actually touch. So I'm going to pick that endpoint, and that's my rotation point, or the point of my rotation, or my base point. Pull out here to the right, and I can see that it's getting close to 0. I'm not doing anything, and as I rotate around that base point, I'm rotating my object. And I'm going to type in an angle, let's say 45 degrees. So I'm just going to type in 45 and hit enter, and I've rotated it 45 degrees around that base point. Now notice as I type in positive numbers, Autocad is going to rotate by default counterclockwise. Let me undo that, and I'm going to rotate again and select my object, hit enter, my base point. I'm going to use the endpoint object snap here. Now if I were to type in a negative number, remember positive, it's going 0, 90, 180. Well, if I type in negative 45, then it should be going negative 45 this direction. So I'm going to type in a negative or a minus sign and then the number 45 for negative 45. And because I'm rotating, it automatically knows that I'm talking about degrees, so I don't have to put anything else there. So I'm just doing negative 45 and hit enter, and I've rotated negative 45 degrees that way. Okay, so that's how the rotate command works. And of course, you can have multiple objects. You could rotate. Excuse me. Let me copy this. You could rotate multiple objects. Start a rotate command. Select my objects. I'm going to put my base point out here somewhere, and it's going to do exactly the same thing. Remember, my base point is relative to those objects, so it's rotating around that base point in a circular fashion. Okay, and I could type in, let's say, negative 30. Oops, I did 030, didn't I? If you look at my command line, I didn't hit the negative. That's okay, but you get the idea. So that's how the rotate command works. Now, scaling objects, let me erase this. I'm going to start with a rectangle. I'm just going to draw a square, rectangle, it doesn't matter. Now the scale command, what that's going to do is it's going to, just like I said, scale your object or increase or decrease the size of your object. Now the scale button is right here, I'm going to pick on that object, or excuse me, pick on that button. It's going to say select objects, just like every other modifying command. I'm going to pick on that object, and then I'm going to hit enter. Now we're going to be asked for a base point when we scale objects as well, just like we did in the move command, copy command, or rotate command. But my base point when I'm scaling an object serves as a reference point, or a point around from which I scale, either increase the scale or decrease the scale. And let me show you what I mean. If I put my base point in the middle of this rectangle, and I'm just going to pick somewhere in space, it doesn't matter, okay? And then I move my mouse around, you'll notice as I move further away from that base point, my object gets bigger. As I move closer to the base point, my object gets smaller, okay? Most of the time you're going to know the scale factor that you want to use. So if you want to increase it 2 times its size, or 1.5 times its size, then what you can do is you can just type in, let's just type in the number 2, because notice on my command line AutoCAD's asking for a scale factor. So instead of me using my cursor to pull and just find a scale factor, I'm going to actually type in the value of 2. So I'm going to type in 2, and that increased the size of my rectangle 2 times. I'm going to undo that. I'm going to start my rectangle or my scale command again, pick my object. I'm going to pick somewhere in the middle of this rectangle, it doesn't have to be perfect, for my base point. So instead of doing 2 this time, I'm going to type in 0.5 on my command line and then hit enter. So it decreased the size of my object or my rectangle by 1/2 or half. Okay. Now I'm going to start my scale command again, select my object. Now this time I'm going to pick a specific base point, and I'm going to want it to scale from the corner, or this corner right here. So I'm going to use my O snaps. I'm going to say endpoint. I'm going to pick the endpoint here, because remember, again, anytime AutoCAD's asking for you to pick a point, you can always use your O snaps to pick a specific or a precise point. So I'm going to pick my endpoint here. Now notice as I scale, as I move my cursor further away or closer to that base point that I picked, it's scaling up or it's scaling down from that base point. So instead of me scaling from or around that center point that I selected the first time I showed you this, my base point, because it's over here on this corner, my object is going to scale or increase in size or decrease in size away from or towards that point that I picked. So now when I pick a scale factor of 2, let's say, there we go, it's scaled it up 2 times. And I'll show you that one more time. Scale, select my object. Select my objects, I'm finished. Hit my space bar or enter key. Asking for a base point. I'm going to say endpoint here. This time I'm going to pick this endpoint. Now it's asking me for a scale factor. I'm going to type in 0.5 and hit enter. Okay. Now you may have noticed on my command line when I did that, I did my scale, select my objects, hit enter, pick my base point. Okay. You'll notice down here on my command line I have these other 2 options, copy and reference. If I just type in C for copy and hit enter, what it's going to do is it's going to scale a copy of that object. So now when I type in my scale factor, I can type in 2, and what it did is when it made the scale, or when it scaled the object, it created a copy of it. So instead of just scaling that object, it keeps you from having to duplicate the object and then scale one of them. You can just scale the object and then select the copy option on your command line, and it'll scale that object but leave the original one in place. So that's how that works. Let me show you that again. I'm going to start my scale command, select my object, specify my base point. Let's say I want to use the endpoint here. Okay. And now down here on my command line, specify the scale factor. Instead of typing in a scale factor right now, I'm just going to type in C and then hit enter. I'm going to use that copy, that option there. And now it's going to copy my object from my scale. So now I'm going to get a scale factor of type in 2 and hit enter. And it made a copy of the object and scaled that object. Now the reference option, when you're scaling, it works like this. It's kind of hard to describe how you do this. Let me see if I can figure this out here. Let me do this. Hold on just a second. Okay. All right, let's say I wanted to scale this object up, this rectangle, from this base point. Oops. From this base point. Golly, sorry. From this base point, and I wanted the right side of that object to touch the corner of that other object. Well, what I can do is I can use this reference command. So I'm going to start the scale command, select my object, select my base point. I'm going to use the endpoint object snap. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit R for reference. Notice on my command line that's an option. R for reference and hit enter. Now it's going to say give me the reference length. So what I can do is this is kind of confusing, so I'm going to start my endpoint command. I'm going to pick right here, start my endpoint command right here, and I'm going to pick there. So now notice as I move my cursor, I've picked those two endpoints. So now I've used a reference length. Okay, so now as I draw or drag over here, I can pick that corner. Let me hit my shift right mouse button, endpoint, and pick right there. So if I don't know what that scale factor is, but I do know that I want that rectangle or that line or whatever to reach that corner, I can use reference length. Let me show you it one more time. So I'm going to start basically what I want to happen is I want this corner to meet this corner. So I'm going to start my scale objects, select my object. For my base point, I'm going to hit endpoint because I want it to scale from this point going to the right. So I'm going to pick there. Now I'm going to hit R for reference on my command line, hit enter. It's asking me for my reference length. Notice I don't have anything selected now. It's asking me for 2 points on my screen. Well, my reference length, I want to determine, or I want to give the reference length. I want to tell Autocad the reference length is whatever the length is from this corner to this corner. So I'm going to hit endpoint here, endpoint here. Now I've given it a reference length. Now all I need to do is just go over here and give it the new length, endpoint there. Okay, so that's scaling objects using reference, and there will be, believe it or not, you will find a time where you use that that option for your scale. Not very often, but there will be a time, and you'll want that. So kind of keep it in the back of your mind. Not something that you're going to use a lot typically, but it's there if you need it. So that is the rotate command and the scale command, and we'll talk about some more modifying objects or modifying tools in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.